Mr. Coltart, I thank you for your time. You used to be part of the Zimbabwean government. Some say that you're bitterly crying from the wilderness right now. What do you say to those?
Well, I say that we've got to go back into history, go back to 2008 and understand the reasons why the MDC got involved in the government of national unity with ZANU-PF. As we recall, in 2008, there was hyperinflation, there was a serious health crisis, and the country was collapsing. Entire institutions like the education and health sector were collapsing. And the African Union and SADC stepped in and persuaded us to join ZANU-PF, not in a coalition government, as one might see in Germany or something like that. It was a government designed to stabilize the country and to agree on a new constitution, which is what we did.
Let's speak about that for a while. Maybe let's take an outsider's view first, and then we'll look internally into what's going on. 2 days ago, Donald Trump went further to extend the sanctions in Zimbabwe by a year, saying that Zimbabwe is not upholding its own constitution. In your view, have sanctions worked at all in Zimbabwe?
So when the sanctions were imposed in the early 2000s, they served a very useful purpose because they identified the perpetrators of human rights abuses. However, they've long since got way beyond their sell-by date. You know, as far back as September 2010, I was on BBC Hard Talk program, and I spoke against sanctions. And my view then, and they're the same view, I express the same view now, that they are beyond their sell-by date. Ironically, my view is that if they serve any purpose now, they serve ZANU-PF's purposes.
So what do we use in the meantime?
Well, my own view, and this is very much a personal view, it's not necessarily an MDC position, is that judge the Zimbabwe government and cooperate with the Zimbabwe government on the basis of its respect for Zimbabwe's constitution. If the Zimbabwe government demonstrates that it's complying with the constitution, then I believe that that should be rewarded, and there should be a developing assistance relationship between Western countries, for example, and ZANU-PF. However, if they systematically breach the constitution, as they are doing at present, then I think the international community has no option but to give them the cold shoulder. That doesn't mean you freeze their assets or you ban them from traveling. You just tell them that we're not going to cooperate with you.
Do you think investors look at Mnangagwa differently? Do you think they think he's a man they can do business with?
I think initially they were taken in by his rhetoric. He said all the right things. Well, I think it went wrong fairly early for those who are watching it closely enough. His rhetoric certainly has remained pretty consistent right the way through. But in my view, he went wrong a year ago when he started to subvert the electoral process, when he appointed a biased chair of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, when he refused to register as voters Zimbabweans in the diaspora. That I think indicated that he was not genuine in his claim that he would hold free and fair elections.
None of this is new, really. Maybe the personnel at the top is new, but a lot of Zimbabwe's problems still exist today that, you know, emanate from the hyperinflation era. Do you think the world still cares about the Zimbabwe story?
Well, it's part of the problem about Zimbabwe. It doesn't have oil. It doesn't occupy strategic sea routes. You know, to that extent, Zimbabwe is not a strategic interest in isolation. My argument, however, is that the world is concerned about Africa. Europe is very concerned about immigration from Africa. And Southern Africa is a key component of Africa, obviously. And for the last couple of decades, Southern Africa has been the sort of bastion of stability. We've seen a progression towards democracy, towards embracing the free market in Southern Africa. And the problem about Zimbabwe is not Zimbabwe in isolation. It's Zimbabwe's role in the context of Southern Africa.
What role do you think South Africa has played through its bilateral and through its, its chairmanship, recent chairmanship of SADC? And where do you think they went wrong?
Nelson Mandela reined in Robert Mugabe, for example, in relation to the Zimbabwe's involvement in the DRC. Mandela was very outspoken about that. When Mbeki came in, he played a very negative role initially. If we remember the Kampepe report way back, where they basically glossed over the serious irregularities in the 2002 presidential election.
Some might ask, is there a difference between that report and the Kgalema Motlanthe report?
Well, exactly. But that's part of this roller coaster. But then, in fairness to President Mbeki, he played a constructive role in 2008. He was instrumental in organizing the government of national unity. And I think that most commentators will say that that saw stability return to Zimbabwe. It certainly saw the new constitution that we got, and that was all positive.
And the Zuma years?
Well, no, the Zuma years were disastrous, to be blunt, because Zuma simply didn't rein in Robert Mugabe. He turned a blind eye. And we're at a very interesting juncture now. We have a lot more confidence in President Ramaphosa because we see him very much being in the mold of Nelson Mandela. We believe that he is someone far more committed to the rule of law and constitutionalism. So we hope he's going to play the right role. But certainly the rhetoric coming out of the South African government hasn't been positive, and we just hope that that's diplomatic speak and that they're being a lot more direct in their private conversation.
What do you make of the Congress that's coming up with regards to the MDC in May, and the challenge that we're seeing of Nelson Chamisa by Douglas Mwonzora? What do you make of that challenge alone? Because some saying that behind Douglas Mwonzora is the force of ZANU-PF, which would rather have him as the leader of MDC. Are you worried about that?
I know Douglas Mwonzora very well. I respect him. He's done a great job as a Secretary General. And if we are a democratic party, anyone must be allowed to contest for any position. However, I think that Nelson Chamisa has demonstrated that he has revived the party and that he enjoys the vast majority of grassroots support. And that's why I back him. But Douglas has the right to contest. It is critically important that we approach that contest in a mature fashion. So, and this is the problem in opposition politics in Zimbabwe. Every time someone puts their head up above the parapet to challenge a position, they are accused of being ZANU agents. I don't believe that of Douglas. I think it's very unfortunate that has been alleged against him, and I hope that rhetoric ends.
Mr. Coltart, part of the criticism that's been leveled against MDC is the fact that, unlike in South Africa, where the Democratic Alliance distinguishes itself from the governing party, the ANC, by how they govern the areas that they have won. The MDC is very popular in the urban centers, if you will, of Zimbabwe, not so popular outside in the rural areas. But why aren't they distinguishing themselves with how they govern their areas vis-a-vis how the country is governed?
I think that this is the big challenge for the MDC. We, going forward in the next 4 years, we have won every single urban centre. And we now have the challenge of trying to run those as best we can. There is a difference, though, between ourselves and, for example, the Democratic Alliance, in that ZANU-PF has never tolerated opposition. And they've made the running of our cities incredibly difficult. They call commissions of inquiry, they suspend councillors, they've done things to MDC councils that the ANC have never done to the Democratic Alliance. So it's a very difficult environment for the MDC. But having said that, I agree with you that the challenge for us in the next 4 years is to demonstrate that we can run the cities, the towns well, so that the population recognize again that we're capable of government.
Where are we in terms of land question in Zimbabwe?
Mnangagwa's government has been a tale of smoke and mirrors since he came to power. There's been such a gulf between his rhetoric and actions on the ground. And of course, his rhetoric was that farmers would be secure, some farmers would...
But David, that's exactly what I'm talking about. On the one hand, it sounds like the rhetoric is of a man who wants to get closer to the rhetoric itself, to live it, if you will. But on the other side, I don't feel like he's totally in control when it comes down to the grassroots.
I believed that initially, but I've now seen, actually, in some regards, his rhetoric changing and the harsher side of him coming out. And that is now also mirrored by the actions that we've seen on farms. So I'm afraid that I believe that the rhetoric of stability in the farming sector was just that. There wasn't any real intention. It served his purposes at the time to curry favour with the West. But I think that he recognises that he's lost that opportunity and now he has to govern through coercion.
That's all we had for this edition of Political Capital, but we return on your screen on Tuesday, 6:30 Central African Time only on CNBC Africa. Until then, keep it right here.